Hey, y'all. Thanks for being here one more time. Um, Hopefully this time we won't have any leaf blowing happening next door, but you never know. We have a big German Shepherd across the street, another very enthusiastic leaf blower to the right, another enthusiastic leaf blower across the street. So we'll see what happens. I am not an enthusiastic leaf blower. I tend not to be extremely anal about yard maintenance. I know that's a shock to you all. Um, so let's get started today. We're talking about the poet Ezra Pound. Pound was born in 1885. So just to give you some idea about where we are now chronologically, almost like in a housekeeping kind of a way. So we have Stein born in 1874. So she's 11 years older than Pound, right? And we have Picasso born in 1881. So he's 4 years older than Pound. And we have Eliot, T.S. Eliot. We haven't gotten to Eliot yet. Eliot born in 1888, right? So he's 3 years younger than Pound. And we have Hemingway born in 1899. So he is, he's 14 years younger than Pound. So he's almost of a different generation, I think you could say, even though there's a mentor relationship develops with Pound, between Pound and Eliot to some degree. Just to give you some idea, this is just in an overview. We're going to go into much more detail, but just in an overview kind of a way. He's probably, Pound is, the most important single figure in the development of literary modernism, period. He had multiple roles in this development. He was an inspiration. Pardon me, allergies. He was an inspiration. He was an innovator. He was a formulator of principles. The era's chief aesthetic minister, if you will. He was an impresario. He was a publicity agent. He was a fundraiser. He was an office boy. He was also a very important poet in and of his own right. And then I'm going to go more, we'll get more into this later, but just to give you some idea of the scope of Pound's influence, check this out. He met William Carlos Williams and Hilda Doolittle, H.D. Some of you may have studied 20th century American poetry here. We have several different teachers that might have shown you that work. Or might have worked through that poetry with you. So Pound meets William Carlos Williams and H.D. at the University of Penn when he was, a young man, and he was lifelong friends with both of them. And H.D., Richard Aldington, and Pound went on to found the Imagist movement, or the Imagiste movement, depending on how you spell it, in London in 1913. He met Yeats, William Butler Yeats, in 1909 through his wife, Dorothy Shakespeare, in London, the wonderfully named Dorothy Shakespeare, in 1909. And he regularly attended Yeats's Monday evening salons at the Woburn buildings. I'm not going to spell out these names and these places and these terms. I've already sent you that, the spellings and the names, et cetera, in a Canvas announcement. Appropriately labeled, so you can find those as usual on that document. So the Woburn buildings, and he's a lifelong editor and poetic confidant of Yeats. Yeats complimented him many times on the degree of quality that Pound brought to Yeats's poetry as a kind of editor and a kind of mentor, an aesthetic mentor. He also persuaded the egoist the magazine, which I'll talk a little bit about. The ego is to serialize Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man in 1914. And he arranges for funding for Joyce through a variety of foundations and grants, which ultimately enabled Joyce to continue writing Ulysses uninterruptedly. Uh, in this way, in that very pragmatic sense, Pound literally helps make Ulysses possible, pragmatically speaking. Joyce sent Ulysses to Pound in manuscript form, chapter by chapter, for suggestions and editing. Pound persuaded the Egoist Press to publish T.S. Eliot's Prufrock and other observations in 1917, and he helped establish the Bel Esprit Trust to get T.S. Eliot out of his job as a bank clerk and working on his poetry. Famously, Pound edited The Wasteland, Eliot's great poem, which we'll be doing after our Pound classes, which Eliot dedicated to him as famously Il Miglior Fabbro, the better craftsman. He persuaded the Egoist Press to publish Marianne Moore's book, Poems, in 1921, her first book. He meets Hemingway in Paris in 1922 and creates a lifelong friendship of literary influence, mutual respect, and support. So listen to that list. William Carlos Williams, H.D., Yeats, Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Marianne Moore, and Ernest Hemingway. He's absolutely central to the development of the literary production of every single one of those figures. And those are arguably the 5 or 6 most important literary figures of the modernist movement in its English language forms. And Pound's right at the center of this. Okay, now that said, he is a hugely, not only is he the most important single figure in the development of literary modernism in its English-speaking mode, he's also, I think, without peer, the most problematic figure. Listen to this. In 1941, so this is a good 15 years, 16 years later than when we encounter him, even long, 17, 18 years, if you think of 1922 as when he meets Hemingway, our last author. He starts doing, so to 41, what is that? That's almost 20 years later. So Pound is 56 years old when this event happens. He starts doing broadcasts for the fascist leader of Italy, Benito Mussolini. The rants are utterly unhinged in a way, actually uncomfortably, we will recognize as creatures of our time and our place and our politics. Utterly anti-Semitic rants. He whines on and on about international usury. He supports Mussolini. He supports Hitler. And this is 1941. This is not 1930. This is 1941. I should say this is not 1933. This is 1941. Well into the fascist steamroller. And he does over 100 broadcasts. Well, the US Army attacks through Italy. and he's captured, and he is tried for treason in 1943 in Italy. And he's confined in a cage. And you see the cages here on the slide. He's confined in a cage. I don't know if you can tell, but you see, if you look closely there, you see the men standing, sitting in silhouette as you go down the line. I mean, they look like something you'd see in at the Humane Society. So he's confined in a cage at Pisa, P-I-S-A, in Italy for 11 months. And he writes 11 new cantos while there during those 11 months. He was snuck pencil and paper, and I have this written down, maybe we'll come to it. I think it was a copy of the Bible. And occasionally he was snuck into an office where he could use a typewriter to type out the cantos by soldiers who I'm assuming they felt sorry for this old idiot who clearly was off his rocker. So he's taken to America in 1945, and he is hospitalized, if that's the right word. He's institutionalized at St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the criminally insane. So he's convicted, and he's convicted of treason, and there's the thought that he could hang, right? Well, he continues to live and to write. And in 1949, so 4 years after he's hospitalized, 4 years after he's really imprisoned at St. Elizabeth's, he wins arguably the most important prize for poetry in the English-speaking world, called the Bollingen Prize in 1949, and these are for the 11 new cantos, which have come to be called the Pisan cantos. This was an extremely, as you might imagine, an extremely controversial prize. He was supported by a large number of writers. We don't have too much time to go into this, but it's a whole story in and of itself, as you might imagine. Very controversial prize. For some, in these cantos, in the Pisan cantos, you can hear, for some, they heard these cantos as an apology, as self-recrimination, as a recantation of his fascist positions. They heard the work as truly repentant. For others, they heard this work as a defiance of fascist refusal, full of no regret. Louis Menand, in a famous article in the New Yorker, calls the Pisan cantos a Pound raging against his captors, raging against his captors. We're not going to have time to delve into this issue, but very, 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 very controversial. That's the way he ended up. And here's the way he looked when he traveled to Europe. And there's Pound and Joyce. And here's Hemingway. Now, this is a letter, as I say, to Archibald MacLeish, Archie MacLeish, as Hemingway called him, the writer, the editor, on August 10th of 1943. So what happened was MacLeish had heard about what was happening, what Pound had done. And he sent Hemingway were they tapes or transcripts? I think there were audio, I think there were transcripts of these broadcasts, which were made as part of the case against Pound for treason. And so he's thinking through what he ought to do. And he can't believe Pound has taken this turn. And again, this is over 20 years after Eliot, after Hemingway and Pound were part of the same circle. So a good amount of time has passed. And 56 years old in 1941, that's not young. So let's just look at what Hemingway writes. His strategy is to, quote, prove he was crazy as far back as the latter cantos. Pound had this ongoing work of poetry that he called the cantos, and he just added to it and added to it and added to it, dozens of poems. He deserves punishment. So this Hemingway. He deserves punishment. And Hemingway, who fought in World War II, he traveled with the armies. I say fought. He was embedded in the army all the way through World War II, famously. He deserves punishment and disgrace, but what he really deserves most is ridicule. He should not be hanged. Treason, right? He should not be hanged, and he should not be made a martyr. It is impossible to believe that anyone in his right mind could utter the vile, absolutely idiotic drivel he has broadcast. His friends who knew him and who watched the warping and twisting and decay of his mind and his judgment should defend him and explain him on that basis. It will be a completely unpopular, but an absolutely necessary thing to do. I like this letter. I mean, it's clear. Pound has become a horrible person. But looking at Hemingway saying it will be a completely unpopular, it is unpopular with respect to the American people, whose sons were dying in order to liberate Europe and to liberate fascist Italy and liberate fascist Germany. Fascist Italy, fascist Germany, which had been already in 1941 in the process of exterminating Jews. The Holocaust as a machine, as an inhumane machine set into motion very deliberately by a number of high-ranking Nazis. In 1941, this had not yet kicked in as the kind of globalizing apparatus of terror that it became. I'm not excusing Pound, but just so you know. But when Hemingway says it will be a completely unpopular but an absolutely necessary thing to do, necessary, and you can interpret this how you see it. But for me, necessary, because Pound's insane, and you can't hang a man who's insane. He's not fit to stand trial. B, he was so important to so many people's careers that they're obligated to stand up for him and tell the hard truth, yes, but also save him from death. And he does. Then I just include a final fragment from the end of the cantos. Let the gods forgive what I have made. It's a very difficult, all my life, all my academic life, I thought of Pound as someone who became vile, but then realized the extent of his vileness and wrote absolutely beautifully about that in the Pizan Cantos. And then I came across that gem. So what happens is he's because of the persistent entreaties on the part of the artistic community, he's let out of St. Elizabeth's in 1958. So he's jailed for 13 years after being convicted of treason and not hung. He does 13 years, and then immediately he returns to Italy in 1958, and this is what you see. Um, okay. Uh, okay, so he's born, as I said, in 1885 in Haley, Idaho, um, and he's raised in Pennsylvania, and he gets a French degree from Hamilton College in 1904, and he studies on the master's degree level. He studies Romance languages at University of Penn, 1905, and he meets Williams and HD at Penn. And he receives a dissertation fellowship in 1906, and the dissertation is never to be written. And he returns from Provence, where he's a multi, he speaks many languages, and he returns from Provence, Italy, to the States to teach at a little college in Indiana called Wabash College, where he's he is caught by his landlady in this little town, Crawfordsville, Indiana. He's caught by his landlady with a young woman performer in a theatrical group that had been passing through town. And she's in his rooms in the morning. This is back in the old days when landladies used to bring coffee and tea and breakfast in the morning and knock and open the door. I mean, these landladies were in charge. And she actually, this is 1907, she calls the president of the university and tells him what she's found. And by afternoon, Pound was fired. And he goes to London in 1908. So he meets Harriet Weaver, who edits The Egoist. And so Harriet Weaver, The Egoist. And The Egoist circle is T.S. Eliot, H.D., Wyndham Lewis, Amy Lowell, Richard Aldington. And the Americans among them visit Paris frequently during this period. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. This is a London group. So he's in London from 1908 to 1920 with that group that revolves around the Egoist magazine. And they visit Paris frequently in that time period, 1908 to 1920. He becomes friends with Ford Madox Ford, the founder and editor of Transatlantic, another little magazine. He discovers Joyce. He introduces Joyce to his circle. And as I said earlier, The Egoist publishes Joyce's first novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He also founds the Imagist group, or Imagiste, with an E on the end, depending on how you pronounce it and spell it, in 1912. And that group includes H.D. Aldington and F.S. Flint. And this group is essentially kind of ratified by his publishing of that essay that I asked you to take a look at, A Few Don'ts by an Imagist, and that's published in Poetry Magazine in 1913. He's also friends with the aesthetician T.E. Hume and the sculptor Henri Gaudier-Brigesca, both of those people killed in World War I. And with Wyndham Lewis, he launches what they call the vorticist movement, vorticist as in vortex, So vorticist movement, which expresses itself in a magazine called Blast, B-L-A-S-T, published in June 1914, just 2 issues. They're just 2 issues, but the ads in The Egoist promised, quote, a discussion of cubism, futurism, imagism, and all vital forms of modern art. He's also influenced by Filippo Marinetti, Marinetti. I can't remember if I've included Marinetti's name. And Marinetti was a kind of a philosopher and an aesthetic philosopher and editor and poet who came up with an idea called futurism, which influenced Pound. We can't spend too much time on these different movements. There's so much going on, but Pound had an oar dipped in each of these different streams. He knew everybody. Everybody knew him. So he goes to Paris in 1920, where he begins the cantos. From 1920 to 1924, he's writing the cantos, and then he moves to Rapallo. I think I've mentioned this in previous lectures. He moves to Rapallo in 1924, when he publishes in 1925, quote, the book, a draft of 16 cantos, book of poetry. Just in terms of influences here, Robert Browning and Browning's Sordello, Francois Villon, the medieval poet, who was capable of a kind of really aggressive realism, which is why Pound, who was a bit of a medievalist, interested primarily in medieval poetry when he was a student. The medieval poetry of France and the Central Europe and France, the troubadour poets, the pre-Raphaelites, including Dante Gabriel Rossetti. I gave you a nice big list of those in that document I sent out, the Pound document. Swinburne, the younger Yeats, T.E. Hume, whom I've already mentioned, Chinese and Japanese poetry, as edited by Fenollosa. I included Fenollosa's name on that document too, who was a translator. Confucius, the sayings of Confucius, late 19th century French writers, the symbolists. I named the symbolists for you in that document as well. Do take a look at them. Dante, right? Dante, born 1265, died 1321, so medieval period. Ovid, as translated by Golding, Homer, Propertius, Catullus. It's a long list. Okay. Just check what time it is now. Okay. He had a couple of important sayings, almost apophthegms, that really resonate for us as people interested in this period. And one was from his essay called "The Spirit of Romance." And here's the quote. Quote, "All ages are contemporaneous. All ages are contemporaneous." It becomes an important quote for the modernists, particularly Eliot. But the idea was that it's kind of a literary bent. The idea was that the great writers of literary history, global literary history, were plugging into aspects of the human condition that were unchanging. They were part and parcel of who we are simply by virtue of our humanity. So, for example, Dante thinking of Eliot's favorite move here, or Homer, thinking of Joyce, thinking of Eliot, and thinking of Pound, um, among many others. Homer still serves this purpose. The structures and modalities and narratives that these writers like Dante and Homer, for example, created, persisted in their relevance, and could be invoked again and again and again in their structures, in their modalities, in their episodes, in the actual language that they deploy in order to express what they express, pardon me, about human beings and the human condition. So it's as if great art, in this case, great literary art, functions across time. And in a certain sense, it doesn't matter when Homer wrote, because what Homer wrote speaks to something in us that is deathless as human beings, that's ubiquitous in our souls, in our spirits, in our hearts as human beings, in our hands as human beings, in our bodies as human beings. And it doesn't matter from what background you emerge or when you emerge into this world. What these great writers speak to is permanent in us. And this is what Pound and Eliot aspired to. And so you can see this structurally operating. Let me just pick Joyce as an example. You could see in Joyce, in Ulysses, published in 1922, which we've mentioned, what he does is he takes the structure of Homer's work, he alters it slightly, but he takes the episodic structure of Homer's work and he lays that episodic structure over contemporary Dublin. And not only does he take the structure and lay it over the work, he takes the episodes, not just the structure of the episodes, right, in the arc of episodes of the work, but also Joyce takes the episodes themselves and sort of transposes them mythologically into contemporary Dublin. And indeed, he transposes Homer's hero, Odysseus, into a contemporary a figure for him contemporary living in Dublin, a Jew by the name of Leopold Bloom. And Bloom's Telemachus, if you will, is a young man named Stephen Dedalus, who also, of course, famously appears not only in Dubliners, but also in The Portrait of the Artist. So it's as though in invoking Homer in this contemporary novel that many people, myself included, see as one of the most important, say, 5 novels of the 20th century. I think it's very safe to say that, and that's not a controversial statement. It's fun to think about what the other ones might be. Yeah, I would say Beloved, and I would say, gosh, there's so many. Absalom. And I would say, when we talk about English-speaking novels, I would say Mrs. Dalloway, and Ulysses. What's our 5th? I have to think a little bit more. Invisible Man. Lots of choices. Golly. Eyes Are Watching God. See, this is what happens. A little book called The Great Gatsby, and so on. Okay, but in taking Homeric structures, Homeric modalities, Homeric episodes, Homeric characters, and transposing them to the 20th century, what Joyce does is make Homer live again in a new relevance, right? And he also, in a certain sense, it's almost like he mythically retrofits his own work to those previous artistic antecedents. He links himself to an ongoing tradition. And the beauty of the tradition is not in its static property. It's not that it stays the same over the millennia, I should say over the centuries. It's that it evolves. It evolves into new relevancies. Yes. Eliot does the same thing to Dante in The Wasteland, which we'll look at. I mean, it's the same. It's what Kurosawa does in Ran to King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear. It's a kind of it's what George Lucas does to Kurosawa when he makes Star Wars in a way that gestures toward Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress, for example, and gestures towards many of the mythological structures that Joseph Campbell talks about in his work that George Lucas went to town on. So you see in Star Wars, as an example, mythic elements that go all the way back to the second millennium BC, and think of Faulkner using the Old Testament as a kind of mythic structure, updating it. Toni Morrison does exactly the same thing. It's very, very, very exciting. So all ages are contemporaneous. All literature is happening now. All humanity is present in us now. How do we contrive of an approach to artistic production, in this case, literary production, that invokes that fact, that not just represents that fact, but presents that fact? You can see how we're touching base with some of the language that we used earlier in the semester, right? And that's the aesthetic challenge. And this is what the modernists were attempting to do. So I'm going to check on time again. Okay, all ages are contemporaneous. Here's another great one. Real time is independent of apparent time. Real time is independent of apparent time. So let's just go over that. I really wish we were together here, because this is always great fun to talk about. But you let that resonate and imagine how you would respond to my questions. Well, what then is apparent? If real time is independent of apparent time, what is apparent time? Apparent time is the time we get when we look at our watches. Apparent time is the time we get when we hear the first peal of the bell and the last peal of the bell on the town, from the church steeple in the town square. Thinking in particular of Mrs. Dalloway. I'm also thinking in particular of Sound and the Fury. Ooh, God, there's another one for our list. My damn list would be all Toni Morrison, all William Faulkner, So that's apparent time. So real time, it would then be time, and this is an idea that Henri Bergson, looks like Henry Bergson, Henri Bergson proposed. That is, there's a kind of real, quote unquote, real interior, subjective time. Faulkner has Dilsey call it in Sound of the Fury, God's own time. A time that we carry with us as human beings in us that resonates with our own condition and is governed not by the ticking of minute wheels that move a tiny arm on the face of a dial, but or not even of the sun casting a shadow on an arm. What is that thing called? I always forget. On a sundial. Not even those. Not even something slow like that, but a time that is inextricably linked to our human experience, that is flexible, that's malleable, that doesn't divide our lives, but is fluid and links one episode in our life to another episode in our life, such that memory, past, desire, future, and being, present, right, are fused. They all happen at once. So real time is independent of apparent time. That is real time. The time, I have notes here on this. The time actually inhabited by our present consciousness is independent of the time we seem to inhabit presently, according to clocks and calendars. Let me just lay that on you again. So real time is independent of apparent time. That is, the time actually inhabited by our present consciousness is independent of the time we seem to inhabit presently, according to clocks and calendars. Okay. Let me give you another great quote from Pound. Poetry is an art, not a pastime. Poetry is an art, not a pastime. And the implication is it requires a knowledge of the history of poetry. In other words, a knowledge of the history of poetic form, the way poets have been shaping the art of poetry across the centuries. It requires knowledge. It requires education. And it requires a knowledge of the history of consciousness. That is, the content of poems, the content of poems, human consciousness itself. It requires discipline. It requires craft. Here's what it's not. This is a very anti-romantic. Remember Wordsworth? I'm looking at my notes to make, this is emblazoned into my consciousness. I used to love the Romantics. I still like the Romantics very much, but I just want to get the quote right. Wordsworth, a spontaneous overflow of emotion recollected in tranquility. No, for Pound, poetry is not a spontaneous overflow of anything. It's a craft. It involves discipline. It involves education. It involves a knowledge of history and so on. Okay. Couple more important little apophthegms. Pound's great injunction for all poets: make it new. Make it new. Find language that expresses that which has not been expressed before, in language in which it has not been expressed before. Make it new. And it seems to me that's part of this evolution, this idea of the past being present in the now and the future being present in the now. And the idea that art speaks to something that has been with us ever since we opened our humanity and saw the world on the world beyond us, the world that can wound us, and the world that can bring us such joy and pleasure and possibility. The world that limits us, and the world that scalds us and sends us to the earth when we get too close to the sun, trying to Daedalus, right? Stephen Daedalus, trying to nail that earlier myth, but also the world that allows us to fly through it. The way it occasionally can. Make it new. Okay, good. Well, I think we can don't want to go over too far. I think we can move on, as we always do, to our jazz. Sorry, y'all. Okay. Okay. And you remember last time we talked about, or I played that wonderful work by Fletcher Henderson. Right. Oops. Let me just bring up the slide. Okay. And thanks for your patience, y'all. There's Fletcher Henderson. There's the, oh shoot. There's Fletcher Henderson in the band. I just wanted to point out, I tried to do this during the actual performance, but here's Henderson here. And this is Louis Armstrong, right? And this is Coleman Hawkins, tenor sax player. So cornet, tenor sax, and then and Whiteman himself, and oops, and this is Don Redman here, the great arranger and trumpet player, and that was Henderson. Now this is Paul Whiteman, and Fletcher Henderson was, I'm gonna be reductive here, but you have to remember, America was entirely segregated, top to bottom, at this point in American history, and jazz. I think with sports and also with music, they were the great catalysts for the eventual integration of the eventual healing of this wound that white America had inflicted upon itself from the very beginning, 400 plus years ago. And Fletcher Henderson was, I'm being reductive here, but was seen as the most important African-American band in the country. They would have called it at the time the most important colored band in the country. They actually would have called it by more vulgar terms than those. Even respectfully, even white musicians respectfully would have referred to African-American practitioners of jazz by the offensive term. It's a very ironic reading what they wrote and what they said, from our point of view, utterly admiring. So I'll talk more about this, but you have white kids, 20, 21, 22 years old, seeing from down, thinking of Big Spiderback, he's a white kid in his late teens going to see Louis Armstrong on a riverboat on the Mississippi River in Davenport, Iowa, and having his life changed. But then referring to the individuals we saw as admiringly as you possibly can, using the N-word. It's a very, very problematic time. I mean, we're sort of in the belly of the beast here. Anyway, so Fletcher Henderson was the best, quote unquote, colored band, the best African-American jazz band in the country, for the reasons that I've just pointed out. He had the best people. Well, Paul Whiteman was seen at the time as the best, the title, the guy's name is appropriate, the best white band in the country. And it was Whiteman's orchestra that first performed. In fact, Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin was commissioned by Paul Whiteman and performed in 1924 at the Aeolian Hall. And it was the very first time that essentially a jazz composition was performed in a hall that was typically used for the performance of classical music. It was a historical event in that sense. So it was Whiteman asserting the artistic validity of this form to a white audience. And I don't want to lionize that too much, but there's an element of cultural truth to that. Let me just Let me just read here before we play it. So this is Whiteman talking about the first time he ever heard jazz. My whole body, he was a classical musician. Okay? He was a conductor, right? My whole body began to sit up and take notice. It was like coming out of blackness into bright lights. You have to forgive the ironies. Coming out of blackness into bright lights. My blues faded when treated to the Georgia blues that some trombonist was wailing about. My head was dizzy, but my feet seemed to understand that tune. I wanted to whoop. I wanted to dance. I wanted to sing. I did them all. Raucous? Yes. Crude? Undoubtedly. Unmusical, as sure as you live. She still doesn't quite get it, but rhythmic, catching as the smallpox, and spirit lifting. 3 years later, he abandoned his symphonic career and joined a dance band, only to be fired 2 days later for being unable to improvise on the spot. So he couldn't do what was the single most definitive artistic gesture in jazz. He couldn't improvise. You can't jazz, his boss said. That's all. Humiliated but still drawn to the music, Whiteman determined to find a way to orchestrate jazz, to retain its rhythm and color and harmony while rendering it as precise and predictable as symphonic music. Let me just say that again, because that's what Whiteman was after. He determined to find a way to orchestrate jazz, to retain its rhythm and color and harmony while rendering it as precise and predictable as symphonic music. His father, superintendent of music for the Denver public schools, was scornful of jazz and deeply disappointed by his son's decision to abandon classical music, which may account in part for Whiteman's self-appointed mission to, quote, and this is Whiteman, quote, remove the stigma of barbaric strains and jungle cacophony, unquote, and, quote, make a lady of jazz. So again, you can see the clear ironies and the clear, the deficits, the failures to understand on Whiteman's part. But it was also an extremely adventurous road to take on his part. Let me just read you this as a way of contextualizing what I've just read. Black musicians may have resented the celebrity and riches Whiteman had gained playing music that they had pioneered. But few seem to have harbored personal grudges against him. No one could deny the quality of his musicianship, and if his efforts to, quote unquote, elevate jazz sometimes seem naive and even patronizing, I would say quite certainly patronizing, in retrospect, those same efforts also redounded to the benefit of all jazz musicians of whatever color. Okay, this is Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington. Paul Whiteman was known as the king of jazz, unquote. This is Ellington, who admired Whiteman's lofty ambitions for his music, his eye for first-rate musicians, and the managerial skill with which he built and ran his band. So Paul Whiteman was known as the king of jazz, and no one as yet has come near to carrying that title with more certainty and dignity. I used to hear Whiteman records taking the snobbishness out of music and opening the doors. Ellington, such an elegant speaker and very discreet, very generous there. But I think, to understand, I think Ellington is speaking the truth. I think he's speaking his truth here, generously, compassionately, but speaking the truth nonetheless. I'd like you to hear this. So there's the Whiteman Orchestra, and here's that's George Gershwin.